Good evening. It's wonderful to see. I've been commenting this evening that thanks to Michael Granoff, we've brought together several different Tufts communities for this evening. And it's the Hillel community, the entrepreneurship community, and the environmental community. And so welcome to all of you. And we're in for an exciting evening. My name is Pamela Goldberg. I run the Center for Entrepreneurship at Tufts, and the entrepreneurship program has over 500 students taking courses. We run this lecture series and a business plan competition, and I have a passion myself for the environment. And we'll hear from Michael as to whether or not he thinks that what he does is environmental. But very excited to have Michael here. The founders of this lecture series, the Lyon and Bendheim lecture series, a couple of alumni who were roommates at Tufts decided that as entrepreneurs themselves, they wanted us to find entrepreneurial alums to bring back to campus to share their story with students. And so once a semester, we invite alumni to come to have dinner with some students, give a talk, and get to visit with students and alumni. So we're very lucky that this semester we were able to get Mike to come back to campus. So for those of you who haven't had a chance to learn about Mike Granoff and Better Place, Michael founded a company called Granoff Investments, which is a parent of Granoff Bioventures and Granoff Energy Capital in 1997. In 2007, he took on the additional role of head of oil independence policy for Better Place. Prior to founding Granoff, Mr. Granoff served as a national constituency coordinator for the Clinton-Gore campaign and managed information for his family apparel business. Since '85, he's co-managed Valdor Farms, which breeds and races trotting and pacing horses throughout the U.S. and Canada. He's served on the boards of several nonprofit organizations, including SAFE, which is Securing America's Future Energy, Hillel, the Foundation for Jewish Campus Life, and a division of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC. And Mike graduated from Tufts in 1981 and also got a JD MBA. Oh, I'm sorry, 1991, pardon me. 2001, last week, I apologize, 1991, and got a JD MBA from Northwestern. And without further ado, Mike, thanks for joining us.
Is this working? I didn't think I needed this, but they said I needed it for the camera, so because I don't like podiums very much, but we'll just leave it there and stare at the podium. But you can tell this is an American audience because nobody's sitting in the front row and people are standing in the back. It was in Israel that everybody would stop here trying to give the lecture. But thank you, Pamela, for an introduction. Thanks for having me. It's amazing to be back here. And Rabbi Simon, how many years have you been here at Tufts now?
31.
31. Okay, so what that means is that it's been 6 years that every Saturday night my family has been using the spices, the basami from your 25th anniversary, to make havdalah at the conclusion of Shabbat every Saturday night. I was noticing it this week, and it's a little ragged. And I was wondering, it's 25. I wonder how many years now he's been here. So now I know. And I can't believe that Sal Gettleman is here because I talk about. I just can't believe that you would come to hear me because I remember very vividly, and I often talk about the fact that when I was a pre-freshman at Tufts, and you came to an event near my home in New Jersey, and the advice that you gave was that whatever you do at Tufts is not likely to have anything to do with what you do for a living, and you shouldn't think about it that way, and you should study what you enjoy studying, and you should learn what you enjoy learning. And that's the path that I followed. And so I accidentally stumbled into being a religion and Judaic studies major with a lot of help from Rabbi Summit, and spent another year after Tufts in Israel full-time studying text and learning 15, 17 hours a day, which was a wonderful, wonderful experience. And then I did what you would naturally do after that, which is go on to a presidential campaign. So, rather, we can talk more about my own journey if people are interested in the Q&A, which I hope I'll have plenty of time for. But more interesting, I think, is the journey of Shai Agassi, who is the founder of Better Place, who is Israeli. He's about the same age as me, actually. And he, his mother was born in Morocco. His father was born in Basra, Iraq. Both of them were victims of being effectively expelled in 1948 when Israel was created and the Arab world went to war against it. And in 1948, they emigrated to Israel, and that's where Shai grew up, spending about a year in South America at the time. And Shai was, from a very young age, a very prodigious entrepreneur in the software space. He founded a handful of companies in his 20s, ultimately founding a company that did something incredible that I can't even explain around enterprise software. It was purchased by SAP, which was at the time the world's leading enterprise software company, a German company, for about $150 million. And Shai moved to California to run their product division. Even though they were headquartered in Germany, he commuted between Germany and California for a number of years doing that. And this is a company that is German, had never had a board member under age 50 or not German. And as a 32-year-old Israeli, Shai became a member of the managing board of SAP. And by 36, he was presumed to be the successor to the CEO. And at that time, he was invited to come to Davos for the World Economic Forum that you probably read about in the last couple of weeks. And there, the founder of the forum put all the people there under 40 in a room, and he said, you've accomplished an amazing amount in your lives to date. A lot of those people who were entrepreneurs already had become set for life, including Shai, and he said, you have a responsibility to figure out what you can do with your skills and your talents and your visions to make the world a better place by 2020. Turns out it was just a conversation starter, but Shai took it seriously, and he said that he wanted to try to answer the question, see if there was an answer to the question, could you run a country without oil? And he spent the next year, nights and weekends, just on his own, kind of researching this question from a blank piece of paper. And it's very important that was the question. Later, when we start talking about what's going on today, and these are very interesting days in the industry that we're in around electric cars, but it's very important to understand that that's the way he started out. Not how do you build a car. A lot of people think Better Place is all about switching batteries, and he must have invented the machine that switches batteries, and then he tried to find a business model and make it work. No, he wasn't motivated by any of that. He was expecting to be the CEO of SAP. That's what he really wanted to do with his life, and he was trying to answer the question, could you run a country without oil? So about a year later, he had about a 38-page white paper that he put together, and he thought he actually had a pretty good solution. And he took the white paper, and there were a lot of people who he had gotten to know in governments around the world in his work with SAP, which served a lot of governments as happened. And so he gave this white paper to a number of people in government, kind of forgot about it. And about 2 weeks later, he was awoken early in the morning in California, phone call from Shimon Peres, the president of Israel. He said, I read this white paper. He said, you did? And Peres says, yeah, and this is a workable solution. This actually can work. And Shai said, terrific, go do it. Because what Shai had actually written was a government agency. The government, the head of state should set up an agency to do this. And Peres has about more credibility to make this statement than about anybody in the world. Because if you know the history of Israel, Shimon Peres has been there from before the creation of the state and is today the president of Israel. He's effectively been in politics for 70 years. And he said, no, that's the one flaw in the program. This is not a government program. Government can't do this itself. This is an entrepreneurial effort. This is a new industry. And Shai said, well, that's interesting. You might be right about that. Luckily, I have a lot of very talented entrepreneurial friends. And what I'll do is I'll find the right one, and I'll connect you, and they can go start this company. And Peres says, well, why don't you go start this company? And Shai says, because I'm going to be the next CEO of SAP. He's 37 years old, and he's been in software his whole life, and this is the sort of pinnacle, and he's almost there. And Paris paused for a moment and said, okay, can you just explain to me what's in the next version of the enterprise software solution that's more important than ending oil? And Shai did not have a good answer for that, and the following week he quit SAP. And to give you an idea of how effectively that Jewish guilt worked, this was no small matter. This was the lead story in the Wall Street Journal. There was a lot of intrigue surrounding it. Nobody could figure it out. It didn't make any sense that the guy at 37, presumably the CEO, was going to just leave the company without an announcement of what happened or where he was going. And so that was March of 2007. I was lucky enough to get connected to him virtually in those weeks. And he resurfaced 6 months later, October of 2007, having raised what many have said it was the largest seed round in the history of capitalism, $200 million based on a PowerPoint presentation to start the company Better Place. So what was in that white paper? How do you run a country without oil? Shai, as I said, started with a blank piece of paper, and he didn't know anything about this, and he thought maybe there's some magical alternative fuel, or maybe the hydrogen economy it was said, I remember, when I was in high school, was 10 years away, and when I was at Tufts, it was still 10 years away, and I think today we can still find that it's 10 years away. In fact, I remember President Bush's State of the Union address following 9/11. He said, hydrogen economy, that's where we're going. It's been about 10 years. It's about time for it to be 10 years away again. But he concluded, actually, that the only thing that could, and the question he was trying to answer was there something that could be market-driven, scalable, and that did not require new inventions? You know, maybe there will be some kind of a breakthrough. I tend to doubt it, actually. Maybe there'll be some kind of a technological breakthrough that will make this question easy to answer. But people have been thinking that way for about 100 years, and it hasn't happened while we've seen technological breakthroughs and everything else, but the laws of physics tend to stay the same. And Shai set as that criteria, this had to be something that the science was here now, that there was no sort of new technology risk. And those were the criteria. And electrification, he said, was the answer. And in fact, electrification, if you look at the last 150 years, has increasingly taken on greater roles in our lives and in our economy. And a lot of people get confused about what electrification really is. It's not energy, right? You generate energy to make electricity, but the magic thing about electricity is that you can actually move it around. We created the greatest man-made machine in the world, called the electricity grid, that distributes the electricity virtually all civilization today. And that's an unbelievable advantage to start with if you're trying to find a way to move the transportation sector off of oil. We talked a little earlier with people I had dinner with about the fact that, you know, how the oil industry came to be dominant in the 20th century, but electric cars are not a new invention. In fact, if you hailed a taxi cab in New York City, probably also in Boston, in 1900, the car was electric. And it was a big battle early on about whether electric would win or gasoline would win or something else would win. And it was kind of made moot by huge discoveries of oil around the world and the energy density of oil and the global economy that grew up around it, thanks to some extent to the commander of the British Navy in World War I, who wanted to diversify away from coal, and so decided it would be a really good idea to put a small percentage of the British Navy actually on oil. And that's what got the global trade of oil going. And then the electric cars, with their big, at that time, very dirty and unreliable and very expensive batteries, they just were no competition. By about this time, 100 years ago, oil began to invade the electric car space, and by the end of the second decade of the 20th century, electric cars were pretty much gone. And then people tried to bring them back a number of times. Some people mentioned a movie, Who Killed the Electric Car? Some of you might have seen, about GM's effort to bring the EV1 to market in the 90s, which they subsequently not only destroyed the program, but destroyed the cars themselves. It wasn't too popular. And so the question is, why haven't electric cars succeeded in the past, and why did Shai think he had a way to make them succeed now? And the answer is all around the battery. And his first idea, the biggest problems are that the batteries are limited in range and they cost a lot. Those are the problems with electric cars. And those are the recurring problems. And you'll see, even if we start to talk about the cars that are now coming to market in these months, which is why it's such a historic period, actually, because we're now, for the first time in 100+ years, seeing actual consumer electric cars come to market. But you still have those same problems. So Shai said, well, if you put a plug in every parking spot, if your car could always access the electricity grid wherever it was, whether you were at home or at work or downtown or at a movie, and you came back to your car and you had the full range of the battery for every trip, you would always have 100 miles. It's about what a sedan battery today goes. You would always have 100 miles. That solves 96, 98% of people's trips. It was when he went to solve the other 3 or 4% that he actually figured out the key to making the electric car work. And that is the only way you could figure out to quickly extend the range of the car that made economic sense was to actually make the battery come in and out, to make the battery switchable. Then you have the issue, well, if you're pulling into a station and a robot is switching your battery out, you're getting a new battery, and your old battery's going to charge, you're driving away, who owns the battery? That's when he realized the battery is not part of the car. And if there's one thing to understand about Better Place, because there's always tremendous amounts of confusion, every week or two there's some blog posting that completely misunderstands our model. And frequently I find myself having to explain to journalists and to people who have misunderstood our model and put things out there that are misleading. The most important thing to understand is that the way that we view the battery is it's not a really big, expensive $10,000, $12,000 component of the vehicle. But the battery is part of the energy infrastructure. And a battery actually shouldn't be owned by the guy who buys the car. Because then you're asking the person to pay an enormous premium. And you're asking them to have to deal with all of the uncertainties around how long is that battery going to last? And what do I do if there's a problem with that battery? And then what's the residual value of a car that has a battery bolted inside? That's probably at that point worth more than the car's worth. And if you ask most Americans to go out and buy an electric car today, their number 1, 2, and 3 assets would be their home, their car, and their battery. So the battery is actually part of the energy infrastructure, and it should actually be owned by a third party. And that's what we do. We buy batteries. So we buy all the batteries in the network. We build the infrastructure, which is in 2 parts. One is ubiquitous charging, which really pretty much, and I've got a year and a half of personal experience driving an electric car, I can say 90+% of the charging happens at home when you're sleeping. Car's plugged in. You wake up, it's full battery, and for me that pretty much gets me to the airport and back, which is the only place I have to go. But home charging is the most important. If you have a plug in your office as well, depending on your commute, then you're really covered, and then you put some number of charge spots out in the environment because there's some places where you're going to go for extended periods of time and you'll want to come back and have your battery fully charged. And then for the long trip, we put battery switch stations. And by the end of this year, we'll have about 50 battery switch stations across Israel and about 15 across Denmark, more to come next year in Denmark. And the battery switch stations take the ones for consumers will probably take 2 or 3 minutes from the time you come in until the time you leave. In Tokyo, we ran a taxi program through most of 2010 with 4 cabs and 1 switch station in the center of town, Roppongi Hills, and those were clocking in about 59 seconds from the time the cab entered until it left with the fresh battery, which is actually faster than I've found most people can fill up with gasoline. So that's how the structure worked. And so in 2007, he raised $200 million. And it turned out Peres had taken him around to the government of Israel, and they had gone and met most of the ministers who were relevant to this, and they met the prime minister at that time, Ehud Olmert, and he told Shai, well, yeah, we'll let you do this, but first of all, the government is not a venture capital company, so you're not going to get any money from the government. And you don't know anything about cars, and I don't know anything about cars, so you need to actually go raise some money and find a top 5 global car maker that says you're not crazy. And so thanks to Peres, and this is in the introduction of the book Startup Nation, so some of you might have read it there, Peres set up meetings with auto executives at Davos the following year after Shai had come up with the concept, and Carlos Ghosn, who's the chairman of both Renault and Nissan, French and Japanese automaker, said, I'm in, which is an incredible statement, an incredible vision for a CEO to make a commitment on that level that quickly. But he's somebody who understood before he met Shai the disruptive nature of electrification and wanted to place a bet on every possible outcome around electrification. And as he viewed it, Israel was not a huge market for Renault, and this was worth taking a chance on. I don't know if he bargained for what subsequently happened in that, now we're talking about many, many other areas of the world. But he made an enormously gutsy move, and it takes about 4 years to go through the production cycle on a car, which is also about as long as we expected the research and development to take to get to a point where we could actually deploy the network for the cars. So this was at the end of 2007, beginning of 2008, and believe it or not, we're on course. We're on track that by the end of 2011, we expect our networks to be ready in Israel and in Denmark, and Renault expects the cars to be ready and is going to be rolling the cars out. And Better Place has made a commitment to Renault publicly to buy at least 100,000 units. Just to put that in proportion, so Israel sells about Israel has about 2 million cars, sells about 100-something thousand cars a year. So we're talking about 5% of the cars in Israel is the equivalent of the order that we placed to begin. You could also compare that sort of to the State of the Union address and the American goal to get 1 million electric cars on the road by 2015, which is in a country of 230 million cars. So you can judge for yourself if that's a Sputnik aspiration or if it's somewhat short of that. But the advantages of Israel and Denmark in being first countries, most people think that the advantage of it is that they're small countries. And that does play a role because we were able to do nationwide networks so that we could guarantee mobility anywhere in the country to consumers on day one. And that's an important thing. But the real reason why these countries actually make the most sense to do first is because you have the product that we are selling. Does anybody know what our product actually is? What are we selling to the consumer? Mobility, right. Miles. So it's actually the same product that you buy today at the gas station. When you go to the gas station and you fill up, you really are prepaying for your next 300 miles of driving. You're buying miles at the gas station because I never saw anybody do something else with the gasoline. I never saw someone sort of put it in a vase and bring it home and blah, People just tend to drive on the gasoline. So it's really the miles that you're buying. And believe it or not, if you look at the top 10 market cap companies in the world, public companies, number 2 is Apple, which is a whole other story in itself that I could tell another time, because I was probably the only person here at Tufts at that time that had an Apple computer. And now I feel like I've suddenly gone into the majority. It's a very disconcerting feeling. It's like suddenly there's a Jewish majority. That's what but aside from Apple, 5 of the top 10 companies in the world are in the business of selling miles. It's Exxon, Mobil, Chevron. It's all the oil companies that we're all so familiar with. That's their business. They sell miles in a way that we're all familiar with. That's not the cleanest miles in the world, and their costs, by the way, the more they sell, the higher their costs go. We actually have the opposite effect. Our miles get cleaner the more we sell, which we can explain why, and the more we sell, our costs go down. So if you're in a business that is actually the most profitable in the world and you're on a declining cost curve, it becomes a very compelling business model. And that's why we've now raised $700 million, which is the most money any company's ever raised before they got to revenue stage. And by the way, we're going to raise more. So we'll increase that record, I think, before we even begin to generate revenue. Although I hope by the end of this year we will be beginning to actually take some money in. But the important thing to understand, I think, about electrification and about our model is that a lot of people see, when we started, I had to spend all of my time pretty much making the case for electrification. And now, 3 years later, no longer true. I have meetings virtually every week on Capitol Hill or with the administration or with the Department of Energy, and everyone pretty much takes as a given that we're moving to electric cars, which is an incredible difference from when I used to have to go in and make the arguments around why electrification was the future. What people don't understand is that the way we see it is that this is going to be disruptive. And what do I mean by that? Well, for just the students in the room, when was the last time you bought a CD for your music? Anyway, Has anybody ever bought a music CD who's a student? Like 10 years ago, if I stood up here and said that 10 years from now you have a room of people, most of them never will have bought music on a CD, nobody would believe it. You wouldn't believe that change could happen that quickly. But it did for all the reasons that we're so familiar with, because it got cheaper and more convenient to do music digitally. Electric cars have to be cheap and convenient, and they're moving in that direction. That's why we think this is going to be disruptive. So a lot of people ask the question, a lot of people in media and in the industry, you'll see people say, by 2020, what percentage of the cars sold are going to be electric? And Carlos Ghosn, chairman of Renault Nissan, is ridiculed for his prediction that it's going to be 10%. Everyone says that can't possibly be, that within 10 years, 1 in 10 cars sold in the world will be electric. And we say, well, we don't know, but by about 2014, we'll pass the 10% threshold in Israel and Denmark. We're pretty sure of that. Because we've got, first of all, we have a waiting list in Israel of about 70,000 already, just based on fleets that have looked at this just as an economic matter and decided to sign up. And based on people who've individually come and visited our visitor center in Tel Aviv. We actually had 2 presidential candidates in the last 10 days. Today, Haley Barbour, and last week, Mitt Romney, who have come through the center. We get a lot of dignitaries, a lot of foreign delegations. But more importantly, we've gotten tens and tens of thousands of Israeli future consumers who have this experience of going to what basically is like an Epcot for electric cars, and you get educated. You get educated about the oil economy that we all know about and about our solution, and then you actually get to go drive the car and see the battery switch and have the whole ecosystem explained and understand what your role as a consumer is going to be. And for most people, it's more than that. They want to sign up for our cars, that they want to be part of the mission. And it's actually been a challenge to figure out how to get all these, to harness all of that excitement and energy. But it's been great because we have a whole cadre of champions now. We're opening a visitor center in the next month, actually, in Denmark and also in Toronto. Although the one in Toronto will be somewhat more modest than the ones in Israel. So when I say it's going to be disruptive, what is the basis of that? Just without boring you with the deep economics of this, we'll just, for a moment, delve into the cost of a mile, which is a product that we're selling. So if gasoline mile is very easy to understand. If you're paying, say, $3 a gallon, your car's getting 25 miles to the gallon, your cost is about 12 cents a mile. Our cost has 3 components to it. There's the electricity, of course. There's the infrastructure that has to be amortized over that mile, and those come to about 3 cents. And then there's the battery depreciation. In other words, that battery has a certain life. We look at these batteries as mini oil wells. They will deliver X number of miles in their lifetime. And so we figure today that the cost of each mile on the battery is about 6 cents. So our cost of delivering a mile today is about 9 cents, about 3 cents less than most Americans are paying for gasoline. So why aren't we just in business here? And the reason is, first, you'd have to put an enormously expensive infrastructure in place before you could appreciate that. And think about the fact that Israelis are paying about 26 or 28 cents a mile, and Europeans close to the same. So that is why we were able to raise as much money as we have. The prospect of actually being able to sell a product that people are paying 26, 28 cents for, and our costs are about 9 cents. And the most interesting thing is, I said the biggest component of the cost of our mile is the depreciation on the battery. It's about 6 cents. A very interesting thing happens that's pretty predictable is that we know batteries get cheaper over time. They don't get cheaper in the way that consumer electronics sometimes get cheaper. There's something called Moore's Law that many of you are probably familiar with. And Thomas Friedman quoted Shai referring to Moore's Law. We got ridiculed again in the blogs because everyone knows that this is physics and there's no Moore's Law for batteries. But what people overlook is that the cost of the electric mile is not the same as the cost of the battery. And if the battery is coming down every year by 10 or 12%, but it's also going from 1,500 cycles to 1,800 to 2,000 to 2,500 cycles, depreciation cost is coming down on somewhat of an exponential curve. And therefore, we think that within 6 or 8 years, that the cost of delivering the battery depreciation component of the electric mile will be about a penny. And then you put in the infrastructure and you put in the electricity, you get to about 4 cents, about $1 a gallon equivalent, which is roughly what it costs to refine and ship crude oil. So all of that is to say that Saudis could make an announcement going out of business sale, giving all the oil away for free, and before you could actually refine it and ship it around, you would still be cheaper to drive it on electricity. So let me just talk for a minute about the United States and the challenges of the United States, and then we can open it up. But I actually talked to a reporter today who said, you know, don't you feel that because the Chevy Volt and the Nissan Leaf are having such success that it's proof that your business model isn't needed? It's not necessary. Look, the cars are all selling. And the fact of the matter is that that's 100% true, and it's a wonderful thing. But if you look at the reviews on these cars, you'll see that they're outstanding reviews. There's one thing that everyone says about the Chevy Volt. That's a drawback. Does anyone know what it is? It's $41,000. And my mom, who I actually got her a Chevy Volt, which she was a little bit nervous about because she's never really driven an American car before. But you know, she tells me it does not. She loves the car. It does not perform like a $40,000 car or like a $25,000 car. So I couldn't tell that, but that's what Mom said. So it's expensive. The Leaf, which does not, and by the way, I shouldn't assume that everyone knows, the Chevy Volt has a very unique range extension mechanism. It doesn't switch its battery, but it has a little gasoline engine in the back that charges the battery after you've gone 30 or 40 miles, which is the range that they give you in a battery. It's really twice as much battery as that in there, but again, they're having to sell these batteries to consumers, so they're only letting you use half the battery, leaving an unbelievable unused asset on the table there. And because you have that big battery and because you have that engine, that's why the cost is what it is. The Nissan Leaf takes a different approach, and it's all electric, and has about a 100-mile range. And everybody is also given very, very good reviews in Nissan Leaf. It's not meant to be as solid a car as the Volt, but it is supposed to be pretty good for its price point. But the problem with that, obviously, is if you live more than 50 miles from your office or close to it, then you might get a little bit nervous about it, or you have to go on a further trip. So again, cost and range, these are the two problems. The other thing is I suggested this reporter I spoke to today that she do a little investigative study on what percentage of Chevy Volts and Nissan Leafs are going to families that are replacing to or adding to their Prius. And I think it'll be an unbelievable high percentage. Why? Because these are cars that are into ideological purchases. How many people here, their family has a hybrid? And how many of you, your family got the hybrid because they really liked the styling of the car? Everybody pretty much, and I'm in the same category, everybody who's bought a hybrid did it really for ideological reasons, not because it was really the best value for a car. And for that reason, hybrids are kind of like Jews in the US. It's about 2% penetration, 2% market share, but if you live on either coast, you think there's a lot more of them. And the point is that as long as the car is a premium car, as long as it's more expensive, then you're going to be limited pretty much to the ideological buyers. A very funny thing happens if you take away the cost premium and you make the car more convenient. You take away the cost premium, and all of a sudden somebody who's looking on Craigslist to buy a $15,000 car that's 3 or 4 years old and has 20 to 30,000 miles on it, and if he could see that there's an electric car that also costs about $15,000 or $16,000, but it's brand new, which car do you think he's going to buy? If he's got the guarantee of convenience, the guarantee of mobility. It becomes a question of not clean versus dirty, but new versus old. And most consumers go for new. And by accident, they will get themselves off of oil. And that is how we think you end oil. That's how we think you run a country without oil, is you make the car that doesn't use oil less expensive than the one that does, and more convenient. What do I mean by more convenient? Again, you're going, every time you have a trip of less than 100 miles, which is 90+% of the time, you never have to stop. When you have to go further than that, then you have to stop for a minute to switch the battery. I was a victim of this convenience because when I spent most of July in Israel, I had already been driving my electric car around New York and New Jersey for about a year. And so I had a Mazda 3 rented in Israel, and I was on the Highway 6 north-south highway. There's not a lot of exits, not a lot of gas stations, and all of a sudden the thing starts flashing, low fuel, low fuel. And I was really kind of startled. I'm like, what is this thing doing? I said, is there something wrong? And I realized that I actually had to stop for gasoline because I'd been driving for about a week. And it was a real aggravation. I was used to the convenience of starting every morning with 100 miles of range. And so, if you have an electric car that is less expensive and more convenient than we think, you actually can get to a point where you run a country without oil. We think that's what the U.S. should aspire to do. And that's the vision that we have for not just Israel and Denmark and Australia, which is another country that we're going to begin a deployment in next year, but for ultimately for the whole world. And China, I was telling some people earlier, they sold 17 million cars in 2010, which is about coming up from about 9.5 million cars that they sold in 2009. And as a result, they added 2 million barrels a day of oil to the global market. We went from about 82, 83 million barrels a day to about 85 million barrels a day. And they're anticipating to add another, 8, 9 million cars in 2011, which take the global oil market to about 87 or 88 million barrels a day. We don't know what the high threshold is. We don't know at what point the world cannot produce 90-something million barrels of oil a day. In fact, the latest WikiLeaks that came out in the last 24 hours was a cable from the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh to Washington saying, we're not so sure about these Saudi numbers, and maybe they can't really increase production at the rates that they claim that they can. So, there are obviously enormous geopolitical implications to our oil dependence that we're all aware of. There are enormous environmental consequences to it, and there are enormous economic consequences to it, not the least of which is the fact that we send $1 billion every day out of the U.S. economy in order to import oil. So getting off of oil has become a mission for me, and it's how I came to be involved in Better Place. I think it's one of the most important things to secure all of our future, and I hope it's something that will motivate all of you to spread the word and help people understand that there is no technological barrier to us doing this. There is no reason why the U.S. goal, instead of 1 million electric cars by 2015, shouldn't be that in 10 years there's no need to bring in new tailpipe cars onto the roads of the United States, that we can just run on all electric cars. So I hope you'll join us in that mission, and I'm excited to answer all your questions for as long as we can.
Thank you, Mike. If everyone can use a microphone, we are videotaping this, so to pick it up, we'd appreciate it. There's a mic back here and then here. Jake, would you mind? Thank you.
Hi, I'm curious, how are you generating the electricity in Israel?
I'm glad you.
I'm
glad you asked that question.
Coal and gas.
Yeah. So no, I'm glad you asked the question because I didn't get to that part of. It's when I understood the answer to that question that I started, I coined the phrase anti-catch-22, which is what I think the electric car is. And we talked, for those who were at dinner, we talked a little about this. But so first of all, the answer to the question in terms of what is the electricity profile of the country, it's different, obviously, everywhere we go. If you go to Vermont, it's all nuclear, right? In this state, I'm not sure exactly what it is. The U.S., generally, it's about 50% coal, 20 or 30% natural gas, 10% nuclear, and then a handful of other things, including hydro and renewables. In Israel, it's not very much different, except there's no nuclear. So there's a couple of answers to the question. The first question, let's assume the worst case scenario is that you're driving your electric car, you're plugging it in West Virginia. And West Virginia, it's 100% coal. It's the worst type of electricity from an environmental standpoint. So that's the worst case scenario. All your miles are being generated by coal-driven electricity. Your emissions, your greenhouse gases, first of all, your ground level emissions are kind of non-existent because there's no tailpipes in the road. There's one smokestack at the coal plant. And because of that, there's one smokestack, and it's required to have all of the greatest environmental technologies attached to it. The actual emissions is 50% less than if you had millions of tailpipes on the road instead of the one coal plant. The more important answer, and again, if you're somewhere else where there's not a high amount of coal, or if it's a smaller proportion of coal, then obviously it's less emissions. The more important answer to the question is this. A lot of people say, well, you can't really put electric cars on the road until you clean the grid. And the reality is the exact opposite. You cannot clean the grid until you put the electric cars. Why is that? Denmark is the best illustration of it. Denmark got to 20% wind electricity generation. And they got very excited. They achieved that incredible goal, and they started putting more windmills. And when they put more windmills, they discovered something very interesting, which is that they were still 20%. The reason is They were getting more wind at night than during the day, and they had no demand for the electricity at night. And pretty soon, they had to actually end up paying Germany to take the wind electrons off their hands at night. Alternative energy is intermittent and unpredictable, and no one knows exactly when the wind's going to blow and the sun's going to shine. And we don't want to just really hope that on Super Bowl Sunday it's really windy so that the TV will go on and we can watch Super Bowl. So if you want to get over the fundamental economic problem with intermittent renewable electricity, you need storage. Storage is really expensive. That's why these batteries that just hold 24 kilowatt hours of electricity cost $10,000 or $12,000. And they put in the stimulus plan 2 years ago $11 billion for storage, which didn't buy a lot of storage, but did make the point that there's no real economic incentive for investors to just invest in energy storage. But if you were investing in an electric car network, which we've proven some people with money and a very good track record in investing might be inclined to do, and if that network was set up as ours is, where every car that's parked is plugged, shows up in the control center, cars are parked 22 hours a day, you accidentally have created the greatest reservoir of electricity storage ever known to man. And as a result of that, in Denmark, when they get to 100, 200, 300,000 electric cars plugged to their network, parked 22 hours a day, plugged to the network, overnight, all the wind that comes goes into the car batteries, charges the batteries. You've now displaced your tailpipe emissions and your oil use with wind from the night before. Better than that, and you can do this in Denmark with the grid they have today. We'll have to improve our grid to be able to do it here, but it definitely can be done. When you get to the hot days of summer and the peak demand on the grid in the middle of the afternoon in August, and you have to fire up the dirtiest coal plant in order to meet that demand. Instead of that, the utilities computer will talk to the Better Place computer and it'll say this is how many megawatts we need, and we can actually take kind of an indiscernible amount of electrons out of each car, put it into the grid, and we've effectively created a power plant. We have TiVo'd the electrons from the night before, the wind, to that afternoon. And that is the only economic way that I can see that we are going to be able to scale renewable electricity and to make an economic way to reduce coal use. We know it's not happening through regulation. That path has been tried and it's failed. And it's failed because the economics weren't there. And you can't legislate something that the economics fundamentally don't work. When you have the storage through the electric cars, it'll happen naturally, because I know the entrepreneurs and the investors that will make the companies that will say, wow, if there's storage there, we're going to put a solar field, because now we know that we don't have sort of this intermittency problem, and we can put all the solar electrons that are generated at the heat of the day into the cars that are parked in the offices and send those back to the grid when we need them. So that's the answer to a very important question, how you generate the electricity and how you can complete the virtuous circle. By the way, just by starting, you're going from 65% imported energy for transportation to 0% for each electric car you put on the road, because all that electricity will be generated domestically. So.
When you're building the infrastructure, what type of vehicles are used to bring equipment onto construction sites, et cetera? You
mean like physically constructing the?
Yeah.
You got me. I think they're gas trucks.
Okay.
But I mean, we're building these switch stations now. They'll last 20, 30, 40 years, and they'll serve millions and millions of switches in electric cars that will offset their emissions. So I think, on balance, we'll come out ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're creating a new industry, right? You're creating a whole new environment in which you can compete in. So, Apple is taking a very closed approach to it. Google's taking very open. For the entrepreneurs in the room, is there a possibility of working within your ecosystem?
It has to be.
And what opportunities do you foresee?
Yeah, no, well, first of all, there has to be. There's no way, we could never make the statement, we're going to go build the electric car network for the planet, right? It would be absurd to think that we could do it as a practical matter, let alone as a political or legal matter. And it has to be an open network. It has to be clear standards. And it's already happening in the industry. In other words, I'm very proud that last Friday I became the very first owner of a residential Better Place charge spot in North America. And this was one of the prizes I got for buying my mom a Volt, because And all of a sudden, our people who realized that we're going to have to make sure that our charge spots accommodate the Volt needed to test it, and they couldn't find one anywhere except for my driveway. So they sent me a charge spot, and they sent me a guy to put it in. And now when I plug my car in New Jersey, it shows up in our control center in Israel. But the plug on our charge spot works with the Volt. Why? Because that's part of a standard for the plug, just like you never went to a gas station and the nozzle didn't fit in your tank, because there's one standard nozzle for cars. So the plugs are already standardized. One big misconception is that what we're trying to drive is standardization of the battery. Battery is very proprietary. The car maker wants a certain kind of battery, wants a certain shape of battery, a certain performance from the battery, and that's going to have to be true for a very long time. I think if we get into the second decade of this, we'll probably end up with 4 or 5 different types of shapes of batteries, like we have, AA's and AAA's and all that. But for the near term, anyway, there's probably going to be a lot of different batteries. And our switch station is going to accommodate that. We can have, the only requirement we have to stock the batteries in our switch stations is that there are lots of cars on the road. So if there's 1,000 Tesla Roadsters, if they had a switchable battery, we wouldn't necessarily do it for that. But a car manufacturer is going to go put tens, hundreds of thousands of units on the road. We're going to stock the battery, and the switch station will know which car is approaching. We'll queue up the right battery, and you'll be on your way. I didn't talk about the user component of this in terms of how much fun it's going to be. That if you're going on a trip, if you're going to work and back, you're not going to use your navigation system, right? You know where you're going, but the car assumes that that's where you're going, and you'll be able to just go and plug in. But if you're going on a trip and you're putting in a navigation where you're going, then your trip will be planned for you in terms of the energy management. Say, well, you're going to need to stop once to switch your battery, and here are your options. And the best coffee is at this station, so that's where you should go. And we kind of have OnStar on steroids, where you're kind of always in connection with our control center, which actually goes live on March 1st for the test cars that are now entering Israel. So it's a very exciting period in that respect. But the bottom line is that if we're right about this, then we will not be alone for long. And we're kind of surprised, actually, there isn't another big global company that's done this, but it's also kind of hard to go out and raise the amount of capital that it takes to do this. And we're beginning to see some inklings of this now in China. We've had a lot of Chinese delegations to our visitor center in Israel. A lot of them, actually, that the government later finds out about. How come they didn't come to Jerusalem? Well, they just came it's not our fault. They just came to see our visitor center. But the Chinese, have a lot of reasons to really need to have a program like this soon, and they've been very public about the fact that they are aiming to lead in electric cars. And I think that's where you're going to see the next phase of networks like ours. Hopefully, some of them will be our networks. We don't know if that's going to be possible yet, but they will all be compatible. It will have to be. And I think if you ask me what is it going to look like 15, 20 years down the road in the U.S., I think it'll be just sort of like AT&T, Sprint, Verizon. There'll be 3, 4, 5 major carriers, major service providers. And the great thing is they won't any longer be competing against oil by then. They'll just be competing against each other. Who provides the best service, who has the best coverage, who has the best customer service, all that. And so that'll be something I think for us to look forward to. Yeah. Oh, I should wait.
Ask one question, which was, what will the impact? What do you perceive the impact will be on electricity prices when you have this increased demand from all these cars? And in these small countries, is it possible that the price of electricity will actually go above that of oil?
Well, electricity prices are pretty much regulated because utilities are usually monopolies of some form. And the cost of generating, right now you have a grid that is at, in most days, 60, 70, 80% capacity at its peak hours, and then 10, 20% capacity overnight, and then, a few days a year it gets into the 90s. And so there is all this excess capacity. There's not a tremendous extra cost in generating more electricity. In fact, it actually helps the utilities to be able to flatten the demand curve, which our software, by the way, optimizes by going moment to moment, how much excess capacity there is in the grid and how many cars can be charged and what's the priority list of how those cars get charged. So I don't think that, and in fact, there have been studies done even before us talking about what would be the impact of putting X percentage of electric cars on the roads in the US, other countries. You get to a very high percentage before it actually even becomes an issue of capacity, which would impact price. So it's not like oil in that regard.
When you mentioned about the calculation of the price of driving per mile, you said that you calculate based on the life cycle of the battery, like about 17 years. I would like to know what is the current lifetime of the battery. And the other question is that what do you feel is the biggest challenge it is in the future?
Okay, so life cycle, there's two ways to measure the life of the battery. One is be in terms over time, and other times of cycles. And really the meaningful one is cycles, because I don't think there is too much degradation on a battery that just sort of sits and isn't used. And today's batteries, advanced car batteries, go about 1,500 cycles, about 100 miles each, about 150,000 miles. And by the way, when they finish that, they don't die. They're considered dead for automotive purposes. They're written off. They're fully depreciated, but they're actually at about 80% state of charge, which means it's really an 80-mile battery. There are a lot of things you can do with that battery. One thing you could do is put it in Hawaii and not tell them, and nobody will ever know that it's only an 80-mile battery, unless they're driving in circles. But you can probably find a service level agreement with customers who would happily take an 80-mile battery, and then you've basically doubled the usage of it. And after its useful life as an automotive battery is done, then it probably goes and becomes a router for utilities, or it becomes just a storage device in and of itself. And after that, I think it's going to have 20, 25 years of useful life and then get pretty much recycled completely, including the lithium, including the rare earth materials that are required in a battery, because they are not like oil. They don't deplete. They're still useful. And like I said, the life cycle, the number of cycles goes up all the time, which is what makes the economics that much better over time and makes it impossible in the future for oil to be competitive with it, which is the wonderful thing about it. One of our biggest challenges, I said over dinner, our biggest challenge today is just on the local permitting level. It's one thing for the prime minister of the country to get up and say we're going to end oil by 2020, and everybody gets all excited, but you still got the little municipal clerk who's got to approve the zoning for the battery switch station to go in this spot. And to dig a hole, if you're digging in Israel, by the way, it's not an easy thing to do from a regulatory point of view. Or the archaeologists come in, and you got, I mean, it's that level of issue that today is what our biggest challenges are. I think my biggest challenge the last few years has just been overwhelming skepticism, which hasn't deterred me, because I see when I go to our R&D center in Israel and I see that everything is actually playing out the way we said it would, which is not surprising given the fact there wasn't any major technological hurdles to overcome to begin with. And you can see the path. But, people are confused a lot by big change in a hurry and don't really believe that's possible. And like I said, nobody would have believed when I was at Tufts, which was not that long ago, right? Nobody would believe that we all have these devices and be communicating and making purchases and all that. So the world does change much quicker than we feel like it does. But it's that skepticism, I think, that we have to overcome. And there really is a need for a political will. If the U.S. doesn't want to, it'll happen in the U.S. anyway. Whatever the government does, it will happen. The difference is the sequence. It will happen after it happens in China and Europe. Europe because of the price of gas where it is today, in China because of their policy that they're pushing it. And I think the consequences of it happening third in the U.S. are very bad. There's, for just one example, the app industry. None of us ever heard of the app industry 4 years ago. Now it's bigger than the music industry. That happened because of the invention of the smartphone. And nobody would have predicted that would have happened. So the car is the super app. You put all the cars electric, always on, always connected. What are entrepreneurs going to come up with? What industries are going to evolve around servicing this car? What are going to be the jobs that get created? It's going to be very, very substantial. And on the other hand, if you're, it was a lovely Super Bowl that Chrysler put on the other day, and I was moved by it because I've spent a lot of time in Detroit in the last few years. But the reality is, if Chrysler is still predominantly producing gasoline cars in 10 years, there will not be a third bailout for them. So that's the level of that we all have to, I think, really stretch our imaginations and overcome and help these industries and policymakers to adapt to quickly.
First off, I just wanted to thank you so much for the presentation. It's very interesting. But I had two questions. The first being, my mom is a recent Prius purchaser, and I'm totally for the electric car. So besides the OnStar on steroids feature you talked about, as well as the cost efficiency, what could I say to her to convince her to go from Prius to electric car? And my other question is, have you thought about doing something with combining an electrical car with a solar-powered car, perhaps with, charging the battery with the sun and storing it as well as the electrical feature?
Yeah, what can I tell your mom? I could give you an answer to the question, but philosophically, the way I feel about it is it's got to get to the point where you don't have to convince your mom, where it's obvious. And that's what we're trying to get to. Now, if she just bought the Prius, it's really a fine car. I drove one for a lot of years, and she'll be all right, and she's getting pretty good gas mileage, so we can leave her alone for a while. And maybe by the time that she's ready for her next car, a better place will have a business in the U.S. She can buy a car on our network. In terms of the solar, we can only solve one problem at a time, and we're taking on the role of putting the cars onto the electrical grid and giving the storage for the entrepreneurs who then want to go and do renewable energy projects that are made possible by the storage. It's a wonderful thing. All the people who want to do the solar at their home and they can be off the grid and charge your car. That's great. We encourage it. It's terrific, but we've got our hands full for now.
Yeah, hello. I would like to know if there are security issues because of the weight of the battery on the cars. Are you aware of?
Safety issues?
Yeah, safety issues, like, because I guess that the battery is going to be more heavy than the gasoline. How do you solve this problem?
The electric car, net is a little bit heavier because of the battery. The battery, the placement of the battery, which is another thing that we faced a lot of skepticism on a few years ago, because people said if you're going to tell the automakers they have to make the car switchable, then you're telling them where they have to put the battery. It turns out where we wanted the battery is underneath the car, and all the cars, whether they're switchable or not, are putting them there anyway, because that's the center of gravity, and engineering-wise, that's where you want to put the heaviest part of the car. But it doesn't. All the evidence to date is that it doesn't have any adverse impact on safety. It might have a positive impact. It doesn't have any adverse impact. In Detroit Auto Show last month, Volvo crashed an electric car, and they had the crashed model on display there. The battery compartment wasn't even compromised at all. And if it was, by the way, it wouldn't likely have any impact. If you tried, and this is another interesting sort of thing to think about in terms of how we do things in this country. My dad worked in the Empire State Building for 35 years, so I became fascinated with a building as a kid. And you know how long it took from the time they conceived the Empire State Building until they had the grand opening? It's about 17 months. And the construction was about 11 months. And meanwhile, we've got still pretty much a hole in the ground 10 years after 9/11. Along those lines, if you came today for the first time and you said, I've got a great idea. We're going to put these vehicles on the highway. They're going to go 70 miles an hour down the highway. They're going to have 20 gallons of flammable liquid on board. What regulator would approve that as a concept, right? So I think that the net on the safety issue will certainly not be negative. Might be even positive because of the way that the car is going to have to be structurally enforced given the placement of the battery. So is that it? I'll stick around. I know there are other people who had questions. So.
Michael, I have the honor to thank you. I'm Jeff Summit, the Rabbi and Neubauer Executive Director of the Hillel Foundation. Welcome to the Granoff Family Hillel Center here. On behalf of the Alumni Association, the Entrepreneurial Leadership Program, Tufts Hillel, it's so wonderful to have you here. Many of us remember when you were our student. Now you come back as our teacher, and we really appreciate it. Just a small token of our appreciation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.